So what I want to do for the remaining time today is discuss Oswald Spengler. And with Spengler, what we get is a sort of shift into, to a certain extent, respectable sort of philosophy of history. We're not going to find any angels or cosmic beings or anything of that nature in Spengler. But what we will find is that Spengler's idea of history is considerably more grounded than Steiner's. For one thing, he's the next generation after Steiner, so his dates are better. A lot more historical knowledge has come in now. They're raking this stuff in, although Spengler still doesn't have the Sumerian culture in yet. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Sumer were ongoing, I think, in the 20s. And Spengler publishes Volume 1 of Decline of the West in 1918, just as the Germans had lost World War I. Now, Spengler was a high school teacher, and he was one of these fellows who didn't care for academics any more than I do, and he just sort of floated around on the peripheries of German culture, whereas Steiner started within the academic culture world of Germany and then departed from it. Spengler never had anything to do with it to begin with. He did get his PhD and so forth, but he spent 10 years working as a high school teacher, and then he was gradually nurturing this idea, and it gradually sort of took shape in his mind, and he decided to quit and go write this book. And he, like Nietzsche, had trouble with migraine headaches, so he was able to get a disability from the state, and he never married. He was a bachelor, and he had a sister who, in a sense, became a kind of, I guess, a surrogate wife for him after her marriage didn't work out. In later years, she moved in with him. He lived up into his 50s and died of a heart attack. He didn't have a very happy life. He was not a happy person at all. And what we know about his childhood was that he was tormented by nightmares and had a very difficult time growing up. We don't know a lot about his background. We just do know that he was this sort of isolated genius. And so he sort of then decides to write this book, and he's up late at night. He's staying up till like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning just reading everything he can get his hands on to bolster this thesis about the decline of civilization. And he says, if you look at the first page of The Decline of the West, he says, my two greatest thinkers are Goethe and Nietzsche. So again, we're drawing from the same culture milieu that Steiner was drawing from. And Goethe is just as large a figure for Spengler as Goethe was for Steiner. But Nietzsche is an even larger figure for Spengler than for Steiner, because Nietzsche was the first, really, to begin to see how civilization falls apart. He was the first to begin to see the way in which his first book is The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's, which he publishes in 1872. And the thesis in that book was that Greek tragedy fell apart the moment that it sort of lost this wonderful balance between the Apollonian tension and the Dionysian tension. And the Apollonian, Apollo, is the god of restraint and the sun and light and reason and structure and clarity. Dionysus, on the other hand, is the god of wine, of madness, of drunken intoxication, of sexuality, the moon. So we have two radically opposed gods. But the way in which those tendencies work into Greek tragedy are such that the chorus represents the Dionysiac element, because the Greek chorus is the collective unconscious of the Greek people. And they're always the ones standing off to the side of the stage saying, we know what's going to happen. Here's what the hero's done wrong. Blah, blah, blah. The hero himself represents the Apollonian element, because he is the individual person who has been differentiated from the mass, and anything Dionysian is collective. Anything Apollonian is individualized. So that and Greek tragedy emerged as this figure kept stepping. Originally, these were just rituals, and these men would sort of wear these goat skins, hence tragos from the word goat, and they would do these sort of evocations of the life of the death of Dionysus. And the way in which the tragedy sort of spun itself into being was that this individual would step out from the chorus and begin to take on a role that gradually began to differentiate itself from the rest of the chorus, and the role would be, say, the individual would incarnate Dionysus or some other suffering god. And they would go through the whole process of him sort of being torn apart and put back together again. And then gradually this began to shape itself. A couple of geniuses came in, and they started differentiating a second person. So once you got those two persons, and you got a dialogue going between them, now you've got the basis for drama. So you have this dialogue back and forth between two individuals and the chorus. That's the Apollonian over here, the Dionysian over here. And normally, Greek tragedy is based on the sufferings of one or another individual who comes to his misfortune as a result of an error in judgment. Agamemnon, comes home from the Trojan War in Aeschylus's play, and Clytemnestra's there, and she makes a bath for him, and everything's all nice and warm, returning home to mother. And while he's in the bathtub, she pulls out a sword and plunges it into him, and that's it for him. And the way in which this is set up, though, is that Agamemnon sort of comes back from the war, and Aeschylus has him saying, well, I sure did great over there, and he's taking all this credit to his own ego instead of making references to the gods who helped him win the war. So that ego inflation is seen as part of the justification for his death. But the real reason, of course, why Clytemnestra has murdered him is because in the beginning, when the Trojan War was starting, none of the ships would sail, none of the gods would allow the ships to sail unless somebody made a sacrifice. Well, Helen is the sister of Clytemnestra, and she's been abducted. They've got to go get her back. Agamemnon steps forward and he says, I'll sacrifice my daughter. So he takes Iphigenia, takes her out, offers her to the gods. She's a sacrifice, and off the winds go. Well, Clytemnestra killed him for that reason, for sacrificing their daughter. Now, it turns out later there are variations where Iphigenia never did die and was left on the island, and we find out that she survived, and all these other variations of it. Yeah, very much so. But the point is that the beauty of Greek tragedy, at the moment when it was great, and Nietzsche says it was great with Aeschylus and Sophocles. And Aeschylus was the brilliant one, I believe, who introduced the second character so that you could have a dialogue between two individuals. And you never have in these classical tragedies more than two people on the stage at any one time. That's the sort of unwritten rule, other than the chorus. And so this beautiful lyrical balance between the chorus and the two other individuals on the stage, and the sufferings of the individual, and the chorus representing the will, the sort of collective will of the Greek people, began to be lost after you go through Sophocles, and Sophocles has this Oedipus Rex drama, and then Euripides comes on stage, and the problem is Euripides brings in too much intellect. He steps onto the stage, and he begins rationalizing things. He's the first to sort of introduce the common man. He sort of brings in these common individuals, and instead of having this exalted, elevated characters who are walking archetypes, they become these sort of common men. And so the gods are portrayed, and the heroes are portrayed as though they were just, whoever from the back alleys. And not only that, but then he has the chorus gradually begins to be pushed out, so that the monologue begins to be taken over, and the monologue develops as a result of this doing away with the chorus and having the lead characters talk through these things out loud. So Nietzsche says that was when Greek tragedy began to fall apart, when the intellect came in. And lost in this perfect balance between Apollo and Dionysus was lost in favor of Apollo. But then Nietzsche says this was happening in Greek culture as a whole during this period, because this is the period of Socrates. And as Euripides was writing his tragedies, Socrates was going around questioning everyone about everything, which is good. I mean, this is the birth of the intellectual soul after all. But the problem with that is Socrates is turning everything into a problem. Everything has to be verbalized and analyzed to death. And for Nietzsche, there's a turning point in every culture where the intellect takes over. And once the intellect takes over and begins to sterilize spirituality and the gods out of existence, the culture begins to fall apart, because it begins to lose contact with its myths. The myths are analyzed and scrutinized, and the light of reason